Ladies and gentlemen, imagine waking up to find the very backbone of America's manufacturing sector under siege. Overnight, Canada has pulled the plug on U.S. factories, cutting off contracts, halting cross-border deals, and sending shockwaves through Detroit, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. This isn't just a diplomatic spat. The White House doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%, and hiked the broader tariff wall against Canada to 35% starting August 1st. In retaliation, Ottawa has slammed U.S. suppliers with targeted duties, activated a new reciprocal procurement rule that locks American companies out of federal contracts, and allowed provinces like Ontario to outright ban U.S. firms from bidding on public projects. The fallout: Ontario canceled a $100 million Starlink contract, pulled American-made liquor off store shelves, and slapped a surcharge on electricity exports to U.S. states. The Detroit-Windsor corridor, a lifeline moving over $323 million in goods every single day, suddenly looks like a choke point. Analysts now warn that hundreds of U.S. plants could lose contracts overnight. And while that number is an estimate, the policy moves behind it are very real. So tonight, we break down how a trade fight spiraled into a manufacturing nightmare, why Trump is fuming, and what this means for workers on both sides of the border. To understand why this crisis hit like a freight train, let's rewind the timeline. June 3rd, 2025, President Trump announces that tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum would jump from 25% to 50%. Effective the very next day. This wasn't just raw metal. The expanded list soon included finished products, everything from transformers and HVAC units to cutlery and industrial machinery. For factories in Michigan and Ohio that rely on Canadian inputs, this was a cost explosion overnight. July 10th and July 31st, the Commerce Department quietly published rules that raised the average tariff on Canadian imports to 35%. With full effect on August 1st. While some goods that meet the strict rules of origin under USMCA still qualify for exemptions, the message from Washington was clear. Canada was now in the penalty box. Ottawa didn't just sit back. On March 3rd, Finance Canada rolled out a retaliation package, a sweeping 25% duty covering billions of dollars in U.S. exports, from metals to consumer goods. And then came the real game changer. July 14, 2025, Canada's federal government activated the interim policy on reciprocal procurement. That's bureaucratic language for this. If the U.S. shuts Canadians out of its markets, Canadian ministries will shut American suppliers out of theirs. With Ottawa's annual procurement spending topping 37 billion Canadian dollars, that's not a symbolic move. That's pulling real contracts away from American factories, and the provinces didn't wait for permission. Ontario, on April 4th, imposed its own restrictions. U.S. firms were barred or limited in bidding on provincial projects, a rule applied retroactively to any tenders issued since March 4th. To drive the point home, Ontario also yanked American liquor brands from LCBO shelves and even slapped a surcharge of about 25% on electricity exports to Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. The most high-profile casualty came at the end of July. Ontario formally canceled its $100 million deal with Starlink, the SpaceX-backed satellite internet provider. That contract had already been on life support, but this time the plug was pulled for good. Now add geography to the equation. The Detroit-Windsor corridor, America's busiest land trade crossing, moves over $323 million worth of goods every single day. Auto parts alone cross back and forth 5 to 7 times before becoming a finished vehicle. So, when tariffs hit metals, when Ontario restricts U.S. suppliers, and when federal Ottawa locks Americans out of contracts, it's not just policy on paper. It's the moment contracts collapse, machines idle, and American plants start losing business overnight. Now let's cut through the noise and look at the hard numbers, because this isn't just about political theater, it's about dollars, contracts, and livelihoods. First, the scale of trade. In 2024, U.S.-Canada goods trade hit $761.8 billion. Canada sends nearly 76% of its exports south of the border, while American factories import metals, auto parts, energy, and specialized machinery from Canada every single day. The relationship is so intertwined that some analysts call it a single supply chain spread across two countries. Next, procurement. Canada's federal government alone spent 37.2 billion Canadian dollars on procurement in the last fiscal year. In the current fiscal year, by March 31st, 32,859 contracts above 10,000 Canadian dollars had already been issued. Historically, about 93% of federal contract value goes to Canadian-based suppliers. But here's the catch: the remaining less than 7%, largely American firms, still translates into billions of dollars in business. Since 2023, U.S. companies have pulled in more than 3.5 billion Canadian dollars worth of Canadian federal contracts. That is the pot of gold now under threat. With Ottawa's new reciprocal procurement policy, that 7% slice is no longer guaranteed. Imagine an Ohio-based manufacturing plant that supplies steel girders for Canadian infrastructure projects, or a Pennsylvania company shipping electrical components for federal grid upgrades. Those contracts are now flagged as at risk. The auto sector is where the pain is most visible. Take the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor. It carries roughly $323 million in goods per day, making it the single busiest commercial land crossing in North America. Auto parts crisscross the bridge as many as 5 to 7 times before final assembly. Now picture that system under tariffs of 50% on steel and aluminum, plus Canada's 25% counter duty on American metals. Suddenly, the math for those contracts doesn't add up anymore, and it doesn't stop at autos or metals. In energy, Ontario imposed a surcharge of about $10 per megawatt hour, roughly 25%, on electricity exports to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. Just last year, New York alone imported 7.7 terawatt-hours of electricity from Canada. A price hike of that scale instantly throws long-term supply contracts into jeopardy. Then we have the headline-grabbing case of Ontario's Starlink cancellation, a contract worth 100 million Canadian dollars. That was a clear example of politics rewriting business overnight, and if one deal of that size can be scrapped, how many smaller contracts are now quietly being terminated, renegotiated, or frozen out of future bids? So when analysts say hundreds of U.S. plants could lose contracts, it isn't a wild guess, it's an extrapolation. Billions of dollars in procurement redirected, tariffs making inputs unaffordable, and provinces actively excluding U.S. bidders. For every lost $50 million contract, that's a handful of plants running shorter shifts or shutting down lines. Multiply that across dozens of industries, and the number starts to look very real. So, who's coming out ahead, and who's taking the hit in this high-stakes trade war? Let's break it down. The winners. Canada's domestic industry. The biggest winners right now are Canadian suppliers who for years complained that U.S. giants dominated too many federal and provincial contracts. With reciprocal procurement now in place, Ottawa has essentially ring-fenced its $37 billion procurement budget for Canadian firms first. That means local construction companies, energy providers, and IT firms are suddenly at the front of the line. And don't forget the massive industrial investments Canada has been making. Volkswagen's battery plant in St. Thomas, Stellantis LG's gigafactory in Windsor, and Northvolt's new facility in Quebec were already drawing billions in subsidies and creating jobs. Now, with American suppliers locked out, the supporting contracts, everything from steel beams to power electronics, will flow even more into Canadian hands. In effect, Canada has turned U.S. tariffs into a catalyst for its own domestic industrial strategy. The losers, American factories on the border. On the flip side, U.S. factories are staring down some very hard numbers. Take the auto corridor in Michigan and Ohio. Plants that relied on Canadian parts or expected to win infrastructure contracts north of the border are suddenly cut off. When contracts evaporate, it doesn't just mean lost revenue. it means fewer shifts, smaller paychecks, and in some cases, layoffs. The metal sector is also bleeding, with steel and aluminum facing a 50% tariff on imports and a 25% counter duty on exports. American mills that once sold into Canada are watching deals vanish. And for manufacturers using Canadian inputs, think auto frames, pipelines, or even appliances, costs are skyrocketing. That makes their products less competitive both at home and abroad. Even energy markets aren't spared. The Ontario surcharge on electricity exports makes U.S. utilities less reliable buyers, and it's raising prices for American states already facing tight power margins. That ripple effect hits downstream industries, everything from data centers in New York to automotive suppliers in Michigan. The political fallout. And then there's the political loser, Donald Trump himself. His tariff escalation was designed to look tough, but it triggered a retaliation that hurts U.S. workers in swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the very states he needs to win. Every canceled contract, every idle factory becomes a talking point for critics who say Trump's trade war is backfiring. So while Canadian firms are locking in new opportunities, American plants are left scrambling. And the irony? The America First tariffs are handing Canada the perfect excuse to double down on Canada first. So where does this go next? The truth is, this clash isn't just a skirmish over tariffs. It's a full-blown stress test for the U.S.-Canada relationship. If these restrictions hold, we're looking at a steady bleed of contracts away from American plants. Canadian federal and provincial agencies will continue locking in their own suppliers. American firms that once counted on billions of dollars in cross-border deals may see that pipeline dry up completely. For workers, the pain will show up in ways that aren't abstract. A plant in Michigan running 2 shifts instead of 3. An Ohio steel mill shelving expansion plans, a Pennsylvania factory losing its biggest client across the border. Multiply those stories by hundreds, and suddenly, 300 plants losing contracts isn't hyperbole, it's the emerging reality. Politically, Trump is stuck between looking strong and looking reckless. The tariffs were meant to signal power, but Canada's retaliation has shown that neighbors can hit back where it hurts. And as the 2026 USMCA review approaches, the stakes get even higher. If neither side backs down, this could escalate into the most disruptive North American trade war in decades. For Canada, the strategy is clear. Use American pressure as leverage to build local capacity, lock in domestic jobs, and diversify partnerships, whether with Europe, Asia, or emerging markets. For the U.S., the risk is isolation, higher costs at home, weaker factories, and shrinking influence over its closest ally. And here's where you come in. This story isn't going away. The policies are real, the contracts are real, and the consequences are hitting right now. If you want to keep up with how this trade war unfolds, who wins, who loses, and how it impacts your wallet, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell, because the next round of this fight could be even bigger, and you don't want to miss it.